Simon, for the presentation. Well, today I'm presenting my last paper related to the meta-study project. As premise, the idea of this manuscript came up during the last summer school, as Simon mentioned. And probably some of you remember in my conclusive comment on summer school emphasized that deliberative democracy remains an unfalsifiable theory. Well, in such respect, I decided to dig into this issue and first to take a picture of the field between young scholars, and second to individuate which analytical strategies best to address the issue of theory falsifiability and concept ambiguity within the field. So today I'm presenting multi-level cluster analysis of young scholar research in deliberative democracy, considering a paper presented during all the 4 summer schools in deliberative democracy. So first, an overview of theory of falsifiability. In 2008, Diana Mutz argued that deliberative democracy fails the requirement of theory falsifiability. In general, she pointed out a normative empirical divide in the field in which theory and empirical works do not communicate much. And specifically, she pointed out an issue of concept ambiguity in deliberation. She claimed that concepts in deliberative democracy are ambiguous because often adjust or transform, say, research targets. Consequently, according to Mutz, it is challenging to create a coherent theoretical framework that will allow the researcher to grasp the beneficial effect of deliberation. Essentially, she pointed out that researchers usually fail to operationalize various meanings of deliberation as independent variables. The second issue she pointed out is a lack of specific causal relationship between variables, between condition and outcomes. She pointed out that the presence of what she called a morass of necessary and sufficient conditions in the field that are inconsistently related together. So a solution Mutz proposed to adopt a middle range theorization. This would allow to force the researcher to formulate a concept into measurable and observable elements, and consequently identify causal relationship between such concepts. Well, since Mutz's account on theory falsifiability in 2008, we assisted a turn in deliberative theory. So a new generation of scholars is born in order to put together the pathfinding, analyzing deliberation within the system, by, for example, searching for interactive relationship between various deliberative practices or elements of the society. Here we have a broader, I would say, and a more fluid understanding of deliberation as communicative activity that occur in multiple spaces. So the target of my research is to provide first, I would say, a picture of the current methodological approaches in the systemic term, between systemic term. This will be possible through 2 analytical techniques. First, I categorize cases into a methodological taxonomy. So the second, by clustering these cases in order to individuate common characteristics across samples. Then I have an analytical target. So here I aim to respond to the question on how we falsify deliberative democracy within a systemic dimension. We'll employ coincidence analysis, which is a set theoretic method, because it allows to identify causal relationships and ultimately determine which conditions are sufficient for theory falsifiability within the system. So the sample is drawn from the 4 summer school in deliberative democracy. So the sample is quite representative of an entire generation of scholars for a few reasons. First, the summer school in deliberative democracy are the main postgraduate events in the field, and they gather together young scholars and leading scholars in the field of deliberative democracy. We have, across the 4 summer schools, we have nearly 90 different young scholars and nearly 40 different leading scholars who participate at the event. Second, the summer school appear after the systemic turn. So it allowed us to identify an high concentration of the 4th generation scholar in deliberative democracy. This definitely shows well an intergenerational interest and I would say an higher concentration of young scholars in the field. Finally, the organizer of the summer school selected the paper considering both quality and relevance of the topic. So this allowed to address the paper that are considered relevant for the field, I would say. My final sample is composed by 29 papers. That all the empirical paper in 2020 summer school and the empirical published paper across the other 3 summer schools. Why? Well, the 2020 summer school is the most recent event. It provides the closest picture for the status of the field, and the published paper for a question of additional quality. So published papers are peer review and are considered qualitatively outstanding and relevant for the field from all peer scholars. At the end, I'm analyzing 35% of the paper presented, 85% of paper presented in the last summer school, 75% of paper published, 71% of paper published in the Q1 journals. So the big majority of the paper are within the systemic term of deliberation. Only 6 papers analyze deliberation from macro perspective of mini public. The factors. So I took into account 6 factors. Well, first, 2 outcomes based on Mutz falsifiability accounts. So I coded the study considering concept clarity, measurability, and causal relationship between variables. Then the other factors that are derived from, say, either account of theory of falsifiability or middle range theory. So in such respect, I identify studies that employ deductive way of reasoning. This is because, according to Popper, deductive reasoning is sufficient for theory of falsifiability. Then study which aim to theory testing, or that address hypotheses based on theory to be tested. And then theory extension target, because falsification, as intended by Lakatos, can pass through new empirical findings that might extend the theory, but also falsify the theory. And finally, inductive reasoning. This is because middle range theory does not exclude inductive reasoning. So the result from the taxonomical categorization, I based this categorization on a paper from Kolkit and Zapata Phelan, who define researcher considering 2 axes. So I create a framework considering a deductive axis and an inductive interpretive axis. So between the deductive axis, we found the category of theory tester, who employ mainly deductive reasoning. Between the inductive interpretive axis, we find theory builder, who explore the theory and inductively or interpretively identify new theoretical construct or meaning. In between, we have a theory reporter, qualifier, and expander. Different location is determined by different degree. Sorry, I should go. So different location is determined by different degree of inductive and deductive reasoning according to different targets. So for example, low deductive reasoning, a study that aims to classify or simplify or simply operationalize a construct according to the theory. High deductive level are the studies that aim to test hypotheses based on complex theoretical models. Similar low inductive researchers are the ones that mainly attempt to interpret a theory within a context, or meanwhile, high level of inductive reasoning is associated with the exploration of new theoretical construct of models. So as we can see, we have on the graph, on the plot on the right, we have a balance between builders and testers, but leader representation of reporter and qualifier, I would say. So if we stand the taxonomical analysis by considering research according to their epistemological dimension, so according to a variance-based method, so the classic quantitative studies that employ statistical tool for analysis, case-based methods that mainly qualitative cases that aim to assess various causal processes across cases, usually through established theory of causation, such as regularity theory of causation, and the interpretative method, or that's the so-called meaning-making papers that aim to individuate meaning instead of causation. We can observe first, I would say, imbalance on the graph on the right. When we look at the cases between the systemic terms. So the big majority of cases are interpretive based, some variance based, and surprising few are case based or even less multi-methodological. Here we can probably already perceive an imbalance between approaches and observe a dominance of interpretive methods, especially within theory building, in which the interpretive methods represent the quasi-totality of theory builders. So in order to provide a complete picture of the status of the methodological approach in deliberative democracy, I've undertook a two-step cluster analysis. Well, I'm not going into details of the technique, but I only emphasize that through this technique it's possible to cluster cases according to predictive variables and output variables, thanks to statistical parameters. So on the one hand, we have predictive variables that are the factors that are displayed to define middle range and theory falsifiability. And the other hand, output variable, which are based on Mutz account of concept clarity and causal relationship between variables. Well, as we can observe, identify three clusters. The first dominated by interpretive-based method and systemic term paper, which is associated with concept ambiguity and lack of causal relationship. The second, which is associated with concept clarity and lack of causal relationship, is dominated by variance-based approach. And I have to say by a moderate and low of deductive method. Finally, the last cluster is associated with by concept clarity and identification of causal relationship, which is dominated by variance-based method, but they are also dominated by a non-systemic term studies. So by focusing on cluster one, which reflect the core of, say, Mutz critiques towards deliberative democracy, we can observe a dominance of the interpretive-based method, which is 93% of the cases. This cluster also refers to all the cases that compose theory building and researchers. So, well, obviously it's not surprising because interpretive-based methods they don't aim to individuate causal relationship or causation, but they aim to making sense to the elements of the research. But anyway, I would like to start a bit of provocative discussion or critical discussion towards theory building. So towards cluster one, which is associated with interpretive method, but also associated with theory building. So I would say the result of this cluster one as well is in line with the current methodological debate within the field, which advocate in favor of, I would say, a constructivist approach of theory building. The discussion I want to address now is, we'll argue the dominance of such epistemological approach, considering the theory building perspective, theory falsifiability perspective, and theory legitimacy perspective. So from a theory building perspective, the first is the context-based issue, what they call, well, we can argue this. A context-based produce what we can see as possible idiosyncratic concepts. So this in theory is translated with concept ambiguity and lack of external validity. This might also be a source of what, as well, Mutz define as painful circularity between theory and empirical evidence. So I mean, we have the theory, which is interpreted, tailored, or even sometimes cherry-picked according to a specific issue linked to a particular context. But this creates, I would say, what we can define as a falsidical paradox, or falsify generalize from a true specific statements. So from a perspective of theory falsifiability, in addition to the usual claim in relation to the concept clarity and causal relationship, here I would like to emphasize an issue of data heterogeneity. So data interpretive methods are subject to transformation through interpretation, obviously, and they're dependent to the context. But this data cannot be used for replication and verify the evidence. And ultimately, so interpretive methods preclude, I would say, middle range theorization and verification, or well, in my case as well, meta-analysis. So that's one of the reasons why it's really difficult to do a meta-analysis in the field. From a theory legitimacy perspective, a theory dominated by a specific epistemological perspective risks to lose some important characteristic. In such respect, we might assist of losing the predictive power and the descriptive power of the theory that are usually associated with variants of case-based approaches. This ultimately have an effect on theory validation and legitimacy. So we can say that without the predictive power, a theory is not really appealing to the decision maker or practitioner because they do not really know what to expect. So how to resolve? So I ran this analysis, this coincidence analysis, the CNA. Well, the analysis undertake aim to identify some answer to the possible issue of, and provide some guidance on how to analyze deliberative democracy within the system. I decided to undertake a coincidence analysis because CNA is a set theoretic method which allows one to identify causal relationship between variables and ultimately establish generalizable conclusion on which conditions are sufficient for theory of falsifiability in deliberative democracy. Well, I'm not going inside in the specific, but one of the reasons because CNA allowed to identify proxy of causation and so make inference of the data. So as we see on this the figure on the left, CNA can organize data considering their set theoretic structures and relationship. So analyze two outcome, the concept clarity outcome, which indicates that deductive approach are sufficient for concept clarity. Well, this is not particularly exciting as a result because obviously deductive approach employ theory to operationalize and measure concept. What is more interesting is the second outcome of identifying causal relationship between variables. So in such respect, the solution formula identify the conjunction of inductive and deductive approaches, or in an equifinal way, it is sufficient to test the theory or middle range theory in order to establish causal relationship between variables. So a bit of discussion on the CNA. CNA, I would say, also reveal, well, when you look at the data and the results and what cases matches to these solution formulas, it's possible to understand what is associated with the systemic turn and what is associated with the non-systemic turn. So, so for the non-systemic turn, it's sufficient to test. So the interesting, so testing, as I would say, condition is only associated with systemic, non-systemic turn. So classic experimental study on many public. That is one example. Meanwhile, systemic turn research are associated with the second sufficient path of condition, well, which are studied and employ within the same research inductive and deductive methods. So these indicate that to falsify theory and middle range theorizing deliberative democracy, we need a sophisticated approach, usually multi-method that merge, for example, variance-based and case-based approaches, or two different case-based approaches. So I'm going a bit deep on the multi-methods and systemic turn. So multi-methods are suitable because allow for more flexibility towards data insight. And well, we can employ, I would say, in a flexible way by using inductive and deductive first and deductive after. So when we decide, for example, to employ inductive first, it would be possible to build and characterize elements of deliberation between the site, which allow to build the middle range hypothesis of the hypothesis to test, then deductively, comparatively test all the sites, considering a larger sample for generalizing the results. In relation to multi-method case-based approaches, it is not really a coincidence that CNA analysis reveals case-based approaches as sufficient paths for concept clarity and theory falsifiability. This because these approaches are flexible towards different sites. Through this approach, it's possible to employ complex constructs based on family resemblance, for example, as suggested by Boswell and Corbett. but in an interpretive method. This approach, anyway, shows a certain degree of flexibility toward data and theory, and this can now as well be made in a systemic way through algorithmic self-transformation, linguistic variable into numeric variables, as, for example, I propose in a forthcoming paper in sociological meta-research. Plus, the solution produced by case-based approaches are generalizable, so consider site, because they are based on the assumption of equifinality. So equifinality allows to distinguish different causal paths in different subgroup of cases. So we have the causation is understood as complex, holistic, but as well as equifinal. So we think that, well, it's possible to reveal what's happening in certain sites, what's happening in other sites, and generalize, even if the paths of the solution term, they're different. Finally, I would say, thanks to the use of causal dependency, so the Boolean difference makers, for example, between a representative population of cases, it would be possible to generalize the finding over an observed set of cases, and ultimately, I would say, enhance the predictive power of the theory. So in conclusion, just in summary, I would say, theory building derivative democracy is dominated by interpretive epistemology. This epistemological monism risks to, I would say, jeopardize the descriptive and predictive power of the theory. And the best way, I would say, to cover this gap is to adopt a multi-method research approach that allows for flexible solution and considering sites in different contexts. And yeah, I think that's it. Oh, sorry.
Cool.
Thanks for
thank you very much, Francesco. Well, we'll hand over to questions. Now, this is the first time I've facilitated in this new online world, and I'm used to Microsoft Teams where there's actually a provision for people to actually put their hands up, which we don't seem to have. And I don't know if I can see everyone on screen doing it. But do that. If I don't happen to see you and acknowledge, feel free to just put something in the chat that you want to ask a question. There is a hand raise button. Okay, I haven't seen it, but if anyone wants to use it and I see it, that's great as well. So between all those approaches, we'll get there. So we'll open up to questions. Anyone have any questions for Francesco or comments? Nick.
Hey, Francesco, thanks so much for that. Interesting work, definitely needed in the field. I'm wondering where the DQI index fits into falsifiability. As one question, I have follow-up questions.
Well, I didn't analyze any paper on DQI, but DQI definitely allows, I would say, to clarify